So the second shiur is in a certain sense a follow-up, but really becomes a critical issue. And even when I labeled the shiur, so I was very careful to put into quotation marks, change in halacha. What exactly is the role of change? When is change possible in halacha? When is change not possible in halacha? We'll try to, again, as we did in the first shiur, try to learn through the sugya, through the Gemara, through the Rishonim, and try to get some basic parameters as to the role of change within the context of halacha. At first glance, when we think about the term change in halacha, so probably our immediate reaction is that it becomes almost impossible to even discuss change in halacha because of the famous Maimon Chazal, Ein beis din yochel avatel, divrei beis din chaveiro, ela begolo b'chachma v'minyan. That a second beis din cannot overturn the psak of a previous beis din unless the second beis din is greater, both in wisdom and in numbers, which is a question in of itself what that means. What does the word numbers mean? At least in the Rambam's understanding of the minyan means the amount of Chachmei Torah who were involved in accepting the takana. But l'chora, once we speak about a second beis din being greater b'chachma, then based on our whole understanding of Masorah, that's going to be very, very hard for us to envision. We're working with the assumption that as the generations go further from Matan Torah, so we go down in chachma, at least in terms of Chachmas HaTorah, and then there's very, very little to talk about in terms of changing, because what right do we, even as a later beis din, have to discuss psakim of previous Bata Dinim? But nevertheless, the Rambam does tell us in the beginning of Hilchos Mamrim that principle of Ein beis din yochel avatel, beis din chaver b'gol b'chachma v'minyan is not always true. The Rambam quotes Yerushalmi that there was a distinction within different areas of halacha, similar to some of the categories that we spoke about in the first shiur. The Rishalmi says that when do we say that a later beis din has to be greater than a previous beis din? That's only in the realm of derabbanans. If the first beis din made a din derabbanan, then the second beis din, 100 years later, cannot just abolish the din derabbanan unless they're godel b'chachma v'minyan. However, says the Rambam quoting the Rishalmi, what if we're not in the realm of derabbanans? We're in the realm of deraisas. And it's not that we're abolishing what the previous beis din said, but we're literally learning the sugya differently. It means the previous beis din 100 years ago learned through the sugya and came to the conclusion that this is what the din deraisa should be. And a later beis din reevaluated the sugya and said, wait a second, we think the din should be different. So the Rambam quotes the Rishalmi as saying, then that rule of Ein beis din yochel avatel does not apply. The correct rule to plug in at this point is Ein l'chal ha'shofet shebiyamecha. Yiftach b'derek k'shmo b'doro, that each group of Rabbanim, each group of Dayanim, of poskim in each generation has to assess based on their knowledge of Torah in that generation. And even though they are on a lower level of Chachma, or a lower level of Chachma of Minyan than previous generations, that doesn't make a difference. That's the din of Chachma, that's the din of Ein l'chal ha'shofet shebiyamecha. So here there's a clear differentiation between dinim deraisa and dinim derabbanan, in a certain sense counterintuitive distinction. The dinim derabbanan are harder to change than dinim deraisa. Dinim deraisa, if you think it's different, the beis din, later beis din thinks it's different, no matter what the status of the later beis din is, they have a right and an obligation of ein l'chal ha'shofet shebiyamecha. So it is clear from the Rambam in Mishnah Torah and the Rambam in his Akdamat to Bereishis Mishnayos, where he talks at great length about this, that it is clear that this principle that a later beis din can uproot a previous beis din in the realm of deraisas is not always true. Yesh v'yesh, there are different levels within the realm of deraisas, and also a little bit of a throwback back to what we spoke about before. Obviously, when you're dealing with something which is a clear Masorah, Ish Rapish and Moshe Rabbeinu, if a later beis din is going to say, well, you know what, the previous beis din said that this is how you shech, but we think it's different, that's absurd. That's not Shofet Shebiyamecha, that's just outright disagreeing with the Masorah. So when there's a crystal clear Ish Rapish and Moshe Rabbeinu as to what the halacha is supposed to be, so obviously we cannot even begin to discuss a beis din changing something else. There's no changing. That's the way the halacha has been nimsa Ish Rapish. But the Rambam is clear. What we're talking about is the following: that the second part of Torah Shabbat, the dinim that are derived from Yud Gimel Midah Shetor Nidreshes Behem, that are derived based on Svara. We mentioned before Medam and Milsa and Milsa. When new issues come up, should we dash in the Kavachoma this way? Should we dash in the Kavachoma that way? So that's what the Rambam tells us, that in the previous beis din they may have dashed in the Kavachoma such and such. And then in the next generation, think, we have a good pircha, we have a good refutation of the Kavachoma. Let's reevaluate it. That's how you dash in the pasuk before. Not so simple. Maybe it's not the klal product klal. Maybe it's a ribur miyad ribur. There's another way of understanding the midah shetar drashas behem. That's the din of ein l'chal shofet shebiyamecha. So where this principle that a later beis din can uproot a psak of a previous beis din is very, very limited in scope. It doesn't apply to derabbanans, because derabbanans, then we are bound by the limitation of gadol b'chachma v'minyan. It obviously doesn't apply to crystal clear Masorah, because then what's there to discuss? Nothing's going to change. It's that area of halacha, which may be a significant part of Torah Shabbat, areas of halacha that are medam and milsa, svaras, things of that nature. The Brisker Rav has a beautiful, as we call it, pshat and a drash, as to really highlights this idea that the Rambam and the Yerushalmi are telling us on Psukim, series of Amar Chazal about Psukim and Megillas Rus. The Psukim and Rus describe a little bit of a give and take, a little shakvatara that took place between Boaz and the Goel as to whether he's going to marry Rus, not going to marry Rus. So Boaz gives the Goel the rights to marry Rus, and the Goel gives a whole shtickle Torah. I can't do it. Why? Penashchisas nachalasi. That's going to destroy somehow my inheritance. So Chazal say, what does that mean? He says to Boaz, I can't marry Rus because my children then may end up to become Sulim Lavoy B'Kol, because the Goel thought maybe she's Asura to me, so then my children will become Pasul. So Boaz explained to him, no, it's okay. It's not brilliant. Well, listen, back and forth again. I'm not learning the Shvu Sugi right now, but there was some kind of a give and take in the world of Halacha that Chazal saw in these Psukim. So the Brisker Rav asks, and the Goel, if the Goel really thought that Rus is Asura to him, why didn't he just say, I don't want to marry her because she's Asura to me? Why did he tell you, Shtickle Torah, if I marry her, my children are going to be puzzled? So the Brisker Rav says, what the Goel didn't understand was, what is the nature of this halacha that Moaviv lo Moavis? So one can understand that halacha in one of two ways, that you're allowed to marry a Moavis. Either you can understand this was pure Masorah, Ish B'Piyish and Moshe Rabbeinu, this was part of a Masorah, this is how you shecht animals, this is how you keep Shabbos, how you build a mikvah, and these are the dinim of Nesuah, Moaviv lo Moavis. What do I say now? The dinim Moaviv lo Moavis is based on a drash in the Psukim. The Torah says, Al Dvar Shal Kidmos Chabelechem V'Mayim. So maybe the Isser only applies to the men, maybe not to the women. You have to pilpulls and a good svar, not a good svar, back and forth. And you can come to the same exact conclusion, but based on a very different vehicle of Torah Shabbat Peh. So the Goel thought that the Dinim Moaviv lo Moavis was based on the second part of Torah Shabbat Peh, based on drushes and svaras and time of the cross, etc. He didn't realize that it was pure halacha Moshe Sinai. So he comes to Boaz with the following taina. I'm perfectly ready to marry Rus. I have no problem. You're the girl of the door. You're the Sanhedrin. You're telling me I can marry Rus. That's fine. And in 20 years from now, there's going to be another base that's going to overturn your psak. And then what? Kids are going to be stuck. They're going to be Moavim, and who are they going to complain to? So comes the goal and says, for myself, the Fiyah Shah right now, I can risk it, but I can't risk it for the future. So that's what Boaz said to him. No, you got it all wrong. This is never going to change. There's never going to be a base in 20 years that's going to question. This is halacha mikublan beis dinam. This is halacha Moshe Sinai. This is not negotiable. So it's a beautiful, again, pshat and a drash that really highlights these two things. On a personal note, Drash, I think you'll appreciate this. I mentioned this Brisker Rav. It was back about 8-9 years ago. I spoke in Eretz Yisrael, and your father-in-law was at the shiur, and I quoted this Brisker Rav, and he came up to me afterwards, and he said that it was worth it. Just such a beautiful pearl. He loved it. He was so excited about this Brisker Rav. It was worth it to come to that shul there. So, upon him, we have some degree of guidelines and parameters as to when the Chachamim can begin to negotiate, to in a sense change a previous psak. In the realm of the Rabbanans, it's possible, but very limited scope. In the realm of pure Masorah, in the sense of Halacha Moshe Sinai, Ish B'Pisha Moshe Rabbeinu, it's impossible to even discuss it. In this middle grounds of Halacha, then we can begin to negotiate. Because if Mishnah, and then later Acharonim pick up on the question and say, if you take this Rambam, this Rishalmi to its logical conclusion, then you pose with a very powerful question on a whole mechanism of Paskin Shailas Bizman Hazeh. It's Yadua to everybody that whatever appears in the Gemara, the discussion is over. When the Gemara comes to a conclusion, this is the halacha, so that we don't sit around and we shouldn't be sitting around in Tafshin Ayin Daled and saying, well, Rav Ashi learned the sugya that way, but I can say shtickle Torah myself. It was a good kavachoma, but I have a pirch in the kavachoma. We don't do that. That's not how our derech halim or derech hapsach works. The question is, why not? Why can't we do that? If the Rambam and the Yerushalmi are really true, that the din of ein l'chal shofet shebiyamecha applies to those areas of halacha which are not pure Masorah, and applies to not dinim derabanan, they apply to interpretation of dinim deraisa. So how come somehow when the Chasimus Gemara, somehow the buck stops here? Somehow nobody would have the audacity to start to say, well, the Amoraim learned the sugya this way, but I think we can learn the sugya another way, and therefore I'm going to come to a different halachic conclusion. Why is that not true? Why isn't that the logical continuation of what the Rambam and the Yerushalmi is saying? So there are different answers that are suggested to this, and Rabbi Chanan, in that same piece that we quoted before, really sums it up based on many of the principles that we said before. Says Rabbi Chanan, the halacha is that a Beis Din can, in a sense, be mevatel a different Beis Din earlier, even if it's not a Gadol B'Chacham of a Minyan, if it's within this middle area of halacha, but it has to be an on par type of a Beis Din. a Beis Din HaGadol can be mevatel a previous Beis Din HaGadol. But one rabbi, or even multiple rabbis, can't be mevatel a Beis Din HaGadol. The Beis Din HaGadol of Yerushalayim gave up psak, and now 100 years later, a group of rabbanim get together and say, well, we'd like to disagree with the psak of the Beis Din HaGadol. That's not called shofet b'shibi amecha. That's called zochim mamre. For lack of a better name, you're not allowed to do. So says Rabbi Chanan, quoting from the Rambam before, the last official psak of Beis Din HaGadol, before they, in a sense, went into retirement, was the Chasimas HaGemara. Now, it wasn't the Beis Din HaGadol of Yerushalayim. The Gemara was not written in Yerushalayim. The Gemara was written in Bavel. But halakhically, it was the Beis Din HaGadol, because that was the last time, historically, that we all got together. It's 1,500 years already. So if you think you're going to make a convention to get everybody on, it hasn't worked yet. So the last time there was a real, clear, absolute kiblu in a sense, Yehudim, to the psakim of Chachmei Torah was really Bizman Chasimas HaGemara. And once that takes place, then any subsequent machlokes cannot even get off the ground because it's lacking in that koach of Beis Din HaGadol. In fact, Rabbi Chanan explains, he thinks that that's ultimately the difference between Chasimas HaYerushalmi and Chasimas HaBavli. The Rif in the end of the Eruvin quotes a tradition from the Gaonim that we just about always follow the Bavli over the Yerushalmi. Why is that? So the Rif gives one interpretation why. So Rabbi Chanan suggests, perhaps based on this Rambam, based on this understanding, a different reason why. He says that the Talmud Yerushalmi was as great as the Amoraim and Eretz Yisrael were, they were not representative of Rav Chachmei Yisrael at the time. There was a thriving Jewish community in Bavel when the Chachmei Eretz Yisrael were writing the Talmud Yerushalmi. When Rabbi Yochanan and his Talmidim were putting together Yerushalmi, Rav and Shmuel were functioning in Bavel, and the Psakim, the conclusions of the Talmud Yerushalmi, were indicative of the Chachmei Eretz Yisrael, but they weren't speaking on behalf of Rav Chachmei Torah of the entire world. By the time the Talmud Bavli was written, says Rabbi Chanan, again, quotes from the Rambam Beferish like this, by the time the Talmud Bavli was written, so the shift geographically had taken place. We can thank the Roman Empire for that, a lot of historical reasons why that happened, but by the time the Talmud Bavli was put into place, the Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael was existing, but was not really, was nowhere near what it had been hundreds of years before, and the up-and-coming Jewish communities in other places in the world were up-and-coming, but they hadn't gotten there quite yet. So it was in a certain sense, a moment in history where you had Rov Chachmei Yisrael being represented in one place, and that was the Chasimas HaBavli. It's not that, it wasn't like a 1 minute thing. It wasn't, one day Ravina Rav Ashi came out with an art school Gemara and everyone signed up. I mean, Ravina Rav Ashi, this was years in making and generations in making, but as time developed, so then this became clearly the voice of Rov Chachmei Yisrael. So Rabbi Chanan says he thinks that's the ultimate reason why the Bavli has precedence over the Yerushalmi, because the Yerushalmi were great Yechidim. The Yechidim Talmud were great Yechidim, but they weren't speaking for necessarily of Rav Chachmei Yisrael, which the Talmud Bavli does, and therefore the Talmud Bavli will basically have precedence over the Pesachim of the Talmud Yerushalmi. So the basic sugya we have in terms of when a Beis Din can even begin to discuss arguing with the previous Beis Din, Dinim D'Rabbanan were very, very limited in scope. Halacha Moshe Messinai, it's impossible. In the middle area, which is a good bulk of Torah Shabbat Peh, it exists, but again, it exists in a very, very limited sense. It exists in the sense of that it has to be a Beis Din versus a Beis Din HaGadol versus a Beis Din HaGadol, or if it's not a Beis Din HaGadol versus a Beis Din HaGadol, when you're talking about a Yochid against the Yochid, then it does exist. But Moshe Feinstein writes this late in his Akdama to his Tshuva Sigus Moshe. So he writes that every once in a while he'll write a Tshuva and he'll disagree with the Chassam Sofer, he'll disagree with Kivay, he'll disagree with Neri Yehuda. So Moshe writes, do you think that I'm claiming that I know how to learn better than Chassam Sofer? Chalil v'chalil, he says, but I'm just following what the Torah says. So Moshe gives a beautiful, beautiful introduction. What are the prerequisites of giving a psak halacha? So Moshe writes, what a posek is expected to do is to try his best, to learn to the sugya to the best of his ability, with hopefully he's zoichet to siyata d'shmaya, and he has to call him like he sees them. And if he comes to the conclusion that the Chassam Sofer should not be followed, it's not that he has an option. He has to paskin that way, assuming that he's a bar hachi, assuming that he's in the league to disagree with the Chassam Sofer. So Ramoshe could write that. If a person feels they're not even in the league, they feel that it's not a being mevatel divrei chavero. He's not chavero. It's a different league. So we mentioned this a little bit before. The yesh v'yesh. There are different leagues. There are different leagues in baseball. Different leagues in learning also. Not everyone who plays little league is going to play in the major leagues. But when you're dealing with someone who's someone of the stature of Ramoshe is able to write that I can disagree with the Chassam Sofer, And if I really think so, then I must disagree with Chassam Sofer. That's the fulfillment of the din of Ein Lecha Ala Shefet Shibya Mecha. But again, this obviously has to be taken with a tremendous amount of Kavod Rosh in terms of how to be able to apply this principle properly. Within the realm of the Rabbanon, so we started off the shir by saying that it sounds like it's really a done deal in the realm of the Rabbanon. So any takana that was ever made at any time in history, we're kind of stuck with because ein beizin chol levatl to beizin chavero. The question becomes though, is it necessary for even a later beizin to begin to negotiate to be mevatl a previous din? Could sometimes dinim that were instituted even by the chacham in previous generations, could they sometimes disappear by themselves? So the answer to that question usually is no. The Gemara says in Maseches Beitza, that when something was instituted, even if the reason doesn't apply anymore, the din is still there and still has to be abolished, and then you have to go through the mechanism of being mevatlet. Generally speaking, dinim don't disappear into thin air, but not always. The Tosfos quotes a Halakhic in the beginning of Maseches Beitza. What if you have a specific din d'Rabbanan that was instituted with a certain time limit? The Chacham instituted a din not l'doros. They made a takana for X amount of time. When the X amount of time, when you reach that limit, do you have to be mevatel it? Do you have to start getting together another bezin to be mevatel it? Or do we say that once the time ends, it's over, finished, come on, it disappears into thin air? So Tosfos quotes a shayla about that. So we usually, many poskim assume, like Tosfos seems to come to the conclusion, that there is a concept of a limited takana, limited gezeira. The Chazal sometimes did institute things for a certain limited amount of times. One of the most famous examples of that is, we spoke a little bit before about the Charamim, about the Chayrim from Rabbeinu Gershom. So Rabbeinu Gershom and his Beis Din made a Chayrim that was not binding on all of Klal Yisrael because I said many Jewish communities didn't buy into this Chayrim, but it was binding on pretty much all the Ashkenazi communities and their descendants, the various Charamim of Rabbeinu Gershom. So what's the most famous one, not to marry two wives. So there are some Rishonim who say that we have a tradition that this Chayrim ended at what we call the Sof Elef HaChamishi in the middle of the 1200s. So this Chayrim was only made for a couple of hundred years. Not everyone agrees to those facts. Some Rishonim say it's not true, that the Chayrim was made actually Olam Voed. So there are different opinions whether that Chayrim was made with a specific time limit or whether it was actually made forever and ever. Nobody should think that even according to those who say that the Chayrim was made with a certain time limit, don't think that it's really over, because there are more rights. They were remakabel as a minig, so it's not going anywhere so fast. But at least in theory, and which may be one of the reasons why we have certain kulas in the Chayrim of Rabbeinu Gershom, may be because of the fact that the Ikar Chayrim may have been only temporary in nature. Why should Rabbeinu Gershom have made his Chayrim temporary, or why should some Rishonim claim that he made it forever? What ultimately is the psychology behind different dinim d'Rabbanan? How come we find that certain dinim d'Rabbanan were made forever, and certain d'Rabbanan maybe were actually made with a time limit? So the Mishkas Yaakov suggested in Shuvah that perhaps it's based on what the reason for the Chayrim or the Takon of the Gzeir was in the first place. Very often Chazal will make dinim d'Rabbanan for what we would call pure religious reasons. They were afraid that people are going to violate Shabbos, so therefore we'll make muktzah. They were afraid of chasdus, we'll make bishalakim, etc. Sometimes there's a clear spiritual, quote-unquote, religious motive behind a particular takana. And sometimes there's more what we would call of a social nature of the takana. That the chachamim have to also be mesachnas olam, as the Rambam writes also, you have to look for the betterment of the tzibur. And sometimes they have to institute certain hanhagas, which are not per se religious in nature, but they're good to correct certain social problems. That's also within the realm of the Batei Dinim. So comes the Mishkas Yaakov and says, Gezeiros that are made b'Torah's religious, they're made b'Olam Voed, because they're an expression of what we spoke about in the first year of Asu Siyag Torah. Asu Gezeiros, you have to make Gezeiros. So the Chachamim feel that we have to make a Gezeir of Muktzah, B'Shalachim, whatever it is. Those Gezeiros, generally speaking, unless we know to the contrary, are forever. But Gezeiros, which are not really Gezeiros, they're more of Takonas, L'Sakan Olam, Yishuv Shal Olam. So then you have to assess it every couple of years, every couple of decades, every couple of centuries. You have to figure out, is this a good takana, not a good takana? So why did Rabbeinu Gershom make his takana not to marry two wives? So the Mishkas Yaakov shows you that there are different reasons that are given, different rishonim for why he made this. Some say that it was a pure societal takana, namely he saw. Somebody saw in his own lifetime. He saw inevitably that there were, no pun intended, a lot of tzaras. That's why tzaras are called tzaras. There were a lot of tzaras, there were a lot of problems. And he felt it's adkan v'lo, it's just not good for the Jewish community to have this issue anymore. And he made it b'Torah's takon l'tikkun olam. If it's only b'Torah's tikkun olam, there wasn't a religious per se motive behind it, so to speak. So then it makes a lot of sense that we shouldn't make changes in the system forever and ever and ever. It comes the year 1248, whatever it is, you reassess and figure out, should we make it, not make it again. But one could argue that Rabbi Gershom made it for real halachic reasons. Some suggest that the reason why he was so concerned when he made the chayrim was because Kozman, that people are generally Yosher Amakomam, people are fairly stable communities. So then, in theory, if a person has more than one wife, everyone knows who's related to, everyone knows who's married to, everyone knows who's brothers and sisters. If you have people running all over the place, like the Gemara describes, because people are going to lose track of who's related to who. If you live in a time when the Jews were in exile, and there's a lot of, Rabbi Gershom saw the up and coming, he was a little bit before the period of the Crusades, but again, probably didn't take that much to figure out that the Jewish community was, things were potentially very volatile. And he felt that to have this situation existing, that a person's going to have multiple wives and multiple families, this is going to lead to not just social problems, this is going to lead to halachic, very serious yichus issues. So therefore, Rabbi Gershom, as a gezerah, said, this is just a bad idea, because it's going to lead to isurim down the line. That's a whole different type of an issa d'rabbanan. So perhaps that's an issa d'rabbanan that should be instituted li'olam v'od. Again, well, it's a combination. It's an issa d'rabbanan which was tacked on to it. A chayim makes it even more chomer than an issa d'rabbanan. It means he made it as an issa. You're not allowed to do it, and if you do it, then we're going to put you in the chayim for doing it. So the kedushin with the evidence stops, but it has the status of an aver to such an extent that they're actually a big machlekes necharonim. Say one of the charon of Rabbi Gershom was not to give a get v'al korcha. So the charonim have a big tzayis and Yehuda, the whole tumult. What if a person appoints a shaliach to give a get v'al korcha of the woman? Is the get chal b'di'evet? Maybe you should say ein shlichut v'avera. So they pilpul is ein shlichut v'avera applied. They assume they're isa, they assume they're abanan. It comes leibudika topic. So it's an isser. It's an isser, and it tacked onto the isser is that there are ramifications of violating that isser as well. So again, the starting point of the Rabbanans is that generally once the takana is made, we have to get a real bona fide Beis Din to uproot it, and it has to be a Beis Din that's even a higher level than the previous Beis Din. But just to say that the Yisr disappears just like that, most probably not, unless it was made for a very specific time. But Afal Pichein, we do find in Rishonim certain examples of Isurim D'Rabbanan, Dinim D'Rabbanan that were instituted, where some of the Rishonim took the approach, well, the particular reason for the Gezerah doesn't apply, therefore the din doesn't apply anymore. And that seems to be very difficult to accept, but the Gemara seems to say not that way. The Gemara says, once something is instituted by a Beis Din, a particular Beis Din Agadol, just because the reason doesn't apply, the din does not disappear into thin air. So how can we find in Rishonim examples where we seem to contradict that rule? So the Rishonim themselves attempt to explain what the parameters of that rule are, some very critical distinctions. Not all Gezerahs, not all takanas are created equal. Some of them can potentially become batel by themselves, and some of them not. So there is a fascinating Shuvas HaRosh, where it's fascinating both halachically and historically. Remember when I was in yeshiva, so it was my last semester of college, and I was majoring in Jewish history, and I was one course short. So I had a very unique privilege of doing some independent study with Rabbi Rosenzweig Senior. So it was all about different, how to read a whole series of different shuvas and write up different papers about some of the societal issues based on the shuvah. It's like going backwards, like trying to figure out what in the world was going on in the communities based on what the shuvah said. So this particular one I didn't read, but it's the same kind of an idea. The Rush has a fascinating shuvah where the background of the tshuva is that we know the Rush was the Talmud of Marmor Rittenberg. The Rittenberg was imprisoned, and the Rush realized he was next on the list, so he very nicely scooted out of Germany and made his way to Spain. So you imagine, Zayeka coming to the Sephardi communities. First thing he needed was a job. So this is the pre-YU placement office. He went to the Rashba. The Rashba was the Rav in Barcelona. The Rashba got him a job in Toledo. It was the smaller Jewish community. So the Rosh becomes the Rav of the Sephardi community. So he writes in his Shuvas that I came from Germany, I come to Spain, and I see a lot of strange things I wasn't familiar with. One of the more fascinating things is that on a different topic, a related topic, he writes that when he came to the shul in Toledo, so he saw that Yom Kippur, the first Yom Kippur that he was there, he saw the davening was very, very long. They were saying all the piyutim that you took out of the Yom Scroll, they had 100 times more than the Toledo Machzer. So they were saying piyutim and yetzres and slichas and maislacha. He said they didn't get the musaf till 4 o'clock in the afternoon. There was no break. And so the Rosh writes, the din is you have to have musaf before it's by mincha, otherwise it becomes a whole complicated shaila. So he didn't know what to do. So he had the shuls nowhere near, they're still in the middle of Shachris, it's already 1 o'clock. And he was the rabbi, he didn't know what to do. So the Rosh writes, he davened b'yechidus, musaf. Yom Kippur, he davened Yechidus, he didn't want to make a machlekes, he didn't want to change the minhag, he didn't want to start up. And you get the impression, I think, from the tour, that he did this every year afterwards. That all the years that he was the Rav, he's the rabbi. Today they'd start another minyan, he'd start a Hashkam minyan. No, that was the shul, that was the minute. So you have to, and when they were saying Piyutim, he was davening Muslim. It gives just a little bit of a little bit of an insight of the Rashmas. But in a related historical issue of a different area of halacha, he writes that he came to Spain and he found something very, very strange. He said he sees that people were wearing linen begadim, linen four-cornered begadim. They were wearing tzitzis on the begadim. And we know the Gemara says you're not allowed to do that. The Gemara says that although min ha-Torah, tzitzis is docha, any yisurim of shatnez, but the Rabbanon, you're not supposed to do that because we're afraid that if you let a person wear tzitzis on his four-cornered beged, next thing you know, he's going to buy tchelas that's not the authentic tchelas. See, they had the same issues back then. Some were saying it's authentic, not authentic. And we're afraid someone's going to end up wearing shatnez shalom b'makom mitzvah. So therefore, midirabbanan, they said, just stay away from the linen. Don't put any tzitzis in a linen bag. It's just a bad idea. So the Rosh says he comes to Spain and everyone's walking around in linen. He doesn't understand what's going on. I guess when he lived in Germany, it was good and cold. No one wanted to wear linen. Everyone was happy to wear wool. Came to Spain, it was a mechaya. I guess in Yom Diyom a little bit of some of us who travel down for the day. So the Rosh writes, what's going on? So he thinks and thinks and thinks. He says he thinks that this Issa D'Rabbanan of putting tzitzis on linen doesn't apply anymore. Why? I think Gemara says Beferish, it's an Issa D'Rabbanan. He says no. The Issa D'Rabbanan was only made because we're afraid people are going to make a mistake and use the wrong tcheles. No one's wearing tcheles anyway today. So he says the whole reason doesn't apply. So therefore, that's what they must have held in Spain, that when the reason doesn't apply, the din doesn't apply. So the Rosh asks on himself, but the Gemara says, Davashab b'minyan, tzarech minyan achal atira. Dinim don't just disappear into thin air. So the Rosh says no. He says, when do dinim d'Rabbanan not disappear into thin air? That's when it's not 100% crystal clear what the reason for the din is. Then it's very dangerous. You're going to start to tell the Balabatim, no, the din doesn't apply because the reason doesn't apply. They don't know what you're talking about. They don't know what the reason is. But if everybody knows this halach is true because of reason X, and everybody knows reason X doesn't apply, so then that's quite an eye-opener from the Rosh. According to this Chuvas Rosh, yet he's not saying it personally, he's saying it in defense of the minhag of Spain, would be a tremendous factor in terms of determining when would we have a right to say if it's so crystal clear what the reason is. There is a piece in Sefer K'tos HaShulchan. K'tos HaShulchan was written by Chaim Noah. He was a very famous Rav. One of the most famous things he was famous for was that he disagreed with the Chazon Ish and all the shiurim. So in his Sefer K'tos HaShulchan with Shabbos, so he raises the question about whether the prohibition of taking medicine on Shabbos applies b'zman hazeh, because we know that the whole Issa was instituted because you may come to crush the medicines. So maybe b'zman hazeh the reason doesn't apply. So maybe the din doesn't apply. So he quotes the Chuvas Rosh. So then he says that you have to have Ruach HaKodesh to apply the Chuvas Rosh. He says, how are you going to know what the mind is about? You're going to take a survey of all the Batim in the world and find out, does everybody know why you can't take medicine on Shabbos? Those who know that you can't take medicine. Those who know you can't take medicine, they all know the reason is because you have to have really big shoulders to take a din d'Rabbanan b'zman hazeh and say, not only do we know the reason is, but the Olam knows the reason, and therefore no one's going to make a mistake, and therefore the din disappears. He says, Ad kedei kach I'm not going to go. But he has a fascinating end of the tshuva. He writes at the end of the piece, he says, I can't be mad at taking medicine in Shabbos. What I can do is, if you have a machlokes about whether a certain shaila is called medicine or not called medicine, at least a fake it is. At least maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. It's like there's a famous fake. They used to joke in Lithuania about the famous fakers. Simcha Zelik was the diamond brisk, and he was known to be a big makel. So there used to be a joke in some Litvish Rabbanim that anytime a shaila came to them, everything was mutter. You know what? It's a faker. Maybe it's mutter, maybe it's also. And even if it's also, maybe Simcha Zelik has a kula. So we usually pass it this way. It's a good other. It's a good other. It's on tape. He said it's also Chodesh Other. It's also on tape. So.
Would the same logic apply to expanding the role of choli when it comes to taking medicine? Because based on Tanna's logic, since there's this.
So again, if you follow Chaim, I think what Chaim Noah really was saying is that there are a lot of issues in the poskim. What's called the chol, not called the chol. What's called the medicine, not called the medicine. A lot of nuances. So we have a right to be a little bit more lenient because in the back of our mind we kind of have that Chuvas Rosh to maybe it's a still a speaker. I don't think anybody really is mata outright to take medicine on Shabbos, but we're allowed to approach the shayla a little bit more l'kula if you accept that idea of repentance. This idea that sometimes a din d'Rabbanan exists that can, in a sense, disappear when the reason doesn't apply. Normally, that's not the rule, but every once in a while we may find that does take place. So you find that in Taisus also. Taisus in Masechus Avodah talks about a very real shaila that probably most of us never think about. That's the issue of Mayim Magulim. Gemara says explicitly that if you have water or wine, any liquid that was left uncovered, you're not allowed to drink it. Gemara says they made an official takanas achamim, not allowed to drink it because it was dangerous, because they were concerned lest the snakes got snake poison in. So therefore they made an issa derabanan. Why did you need an issa derabanan? If it's dangerous, it's also min Torah. So the answer is it wasn't so dangerous. It's very unlikely. Something that's outright dangerous, of course, it's also min Torah. You don't need the chachamim to tell you that a certain activity is prohibited. If it's mamish dangerous, of course it's also. The activity is that it's not so dangerous. So you need an official form of Tachanas Achamim to tell you, don't risk it and don't drink the water. So Taisus and Avodah Zarah writes, we all drink Mayim Magulim. Bisman hazeh. We're not concerned with it. Why are we not concerned? Because there are no snakes around, says Taisus. We're not so concerned with the Mayim Magulim. So if that's the case, that we're not concerned with Mayim Magulim, wait a second, if it was a real Tachanas Achamim, so then don't we need a minyan achel atira? Don't we have to formally abolish the Tachanas Achamim? So the answer is, Taisus seems to say, and then later Acharonim pick up upon, that even when the takana was made not to drink mayim magulim, it wasn't made as a low plug. It wasn't made across the world. It was only made if you live in a place where there are snakes. Then you have to be choshesh for the off chance that maybe a snake took some of the water. But if you lived in a place, you lived in the North Pole, there were never snakes, even Bisman Chazal. So then the gezeira was never made for you. So Bisman Hazeh, our communities are like those communities of old that were never included in the gezeira. So you have certain gezeiras that were made below plug, and certain gezeiros are not made below plug. Sometimes it's not so easy to tell the difference. A very famous one that we spoke about earlier in the previous year, but not blowing shofar on Rosh Hashanah Chelas b'Shabbos. This is one of the hardest things to explain to people. The Balabas will come and ask you, Rabbi, how come we don't blow shofar today? He wants the davening to be long. How come we don't blow shofar today? So you say, you can't blow shofar because we're afraid you're going to carry the shofar. So he looks like you're from the moon. He said, I understand. I carry my machzor, I carry my talis to shul. I'm pushing my baby carriage home. Everybody's carrying, and you're telling me I can't blow shofar because I'm afraid I'm going to carry. So he's right. His kasha is a really good kasha. The answer to his question is that this was one of those takanas, one of the gezeros that were made as a low plug. That this gezer was made across the board. This gezer was made even in a case where there is an eruv. It's a little bit tricky because we know that the Chacham did exclude one place from this gezerah. They excluded Beis Din. They said Yerushalayim, Beis Din, Mikdash. So it's a very, very tricky. But Chutz LaBeis Din, somehow it was assumed to be a low plug. We don't find in Chazal you can blow shofar in a place where there's an eruv. We never find any precedent that you can blow shofar in an eruv. So Mistami, I have to say that this is kind of walking a very, very fine tightrope as to what type of a low plug this was. But again, the basic principle is true that Dinim D'Rabbanan don't just disappear into thin air. They have to be reevaluated by a later Beis Din, and the later Beis Din would have to be Gadol B'Chacham over Minyan, and only in the very limited circumstances, either the situation of the Rosh or the situation of the Tosfos, to try to extrapolate properly what would be a modern day application becomes, of course, significantly trickier. But those are the klolim that the Rishonim begin to develop as to when we can begin to negotiate a Din D'Rabbanan in a sense disappear. There is another example where a Din D'Rabbanan does disappear, and here the Gemara says explicitly, if the Din D'Rabbanan shouldn't have taken place in the first place. Let's say, for example, a Gezerah, the kind of something was made, and it was never really accepted by the Tzibur, that it's a Gezerah that shouldn't have been made in the first place. Because Ein goes in Gezerah la Tzibur, Elim came rov Tzibur chol lamed ba, but Beis Din tries their best, but sometimes they miscalculated. They made a certain takana, a certain gezerah. As we spoke already several times, it sometimes takes years, it can take generations till we come to the realization that this takana just never really took off. It never really should happen in the first place. So then the Rishonim write, then you don't need the official mechanism, the official channels of a bittul, of a rov chacham minyan. Then the gezerah pretty much can be abolished by itself. So that's an example that Taisus writes about Takanas Ezra. The sugyas in the third parak of Bracha speak about how Ezra made a takana that a balkari man becomes tamei, so he's not allowed to learn, not allowed to brachas, not allowed to daven. And then the Gemara says in the days of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, so basically they abolished that takana. So Taisus asks on the spot, how could he abolish that takana? He wasn't Gadol b'Chachma and Ezra. So what right did Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira 500 years later to be mevatel the takana of Ezra? So Taisus writes that Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira realized that it was lo pashta b'Rav Yisrael, was never really accepted. this is 500 years. This is a long time from Ezra to Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. It took a long time until they finally came to the conclusion that this takana just never really is actually catching on, and therefore, in a sense, we're mevatel it. So other Rishonim write a similar idea when it comes to pasakum. The Mishnah says explicitly in Masechus Avodah Zarah, you can't eat food cooked by a non-Jew, and you can't eat bread baked by a non-Jew. And yet, when it comes to pasakum, we are very, very, very lenient. We assume that as long as it's what's called pas palter, it's a professional baker, so we look the other way and we eat pasakum. So the Rishonim say, but the Gemara doesn't say that. The Gemara talks a little bit about pas palter, but we are much more makel than the Gemara seems to say explicitly. So the Rishonim explain, they quote the Rishonim that seems to say this, that this was a gezeira that was made that was really aimed it was too hard, and the takana the gezeira never really took root, and it was never niskabel legamre beklal Yisrael, and therefore it was this battle of a miktas. It wasn't this battle of legamre, because if it's pas balabayas, if it's a private baked bread, even if the ingredients are kosher, you should not eat it. But if it's a professional baker, then we're very, very lenient on this. So it's interesting that these two examples that the Gemara and the Rishonim highlight of takonas and gezeiros that were made that didn't quite catch on, and therefore, for all practical purposes, pretty much disappeared. It's interesting because both of them made a little bit of a comeback at around the same time of the year. They both made a comeback around the Yom Noraim time. And all of a sudden, Kumta, Seres Mechuvah, everyone becomes firm again. Everyone becomes, Pasakum. I always say that I get more shilas during the Seres Mechuvah, not about how to do tshuva. It's true. And once a friend of mine said, I'd love to do tshuva during the Seres Mechuvah, but I'm too busy saying slichas and trying to make sure that my donuts are on Pasakum. I don't have time to do tshuva. So the Seres Mechuvah, all of a sudden, everyone's makbid in Pasakum. And all of a sudden, Tfilas Ezra makes a comeback. Everybody goes to the mikveh. Roshana, everyone comes back. All of a sudden, everyone becomes Chasid. Everyone becomes makbid and Takanas Ezra. So many Dacharim explain that it's more than just a minute to observe Aseres Mechuvah Pasachim. It's more than just a minute to go to the mikveh of Yom Kippur. The reason why these gezeiros at the Kanas when it's batlo was because the tzibur just couldn't hold them. It was too hard to keep these dinim derabanan, and therefore anything that cannot be accepted by the tzibur, memela becomes a batlo. But Klal Yisrael, in a sense, voted. I mean, not a little umdul but in a certain sense, Klal Yisrael voted through the actions over the years that although we can't quite live on the highest standards all year long and observe Takanas Ezra, we can't quite live in the highest standards and observe Pas Akum all year long, but certain days of the year, we can go the extra mile. Certain days of the year, we can show we want to be. This is where we want to be. We would like the halavai, we should be zoicha to Kedusha V'Tara of Takanas Ezra all year long. Halavai, we should be up to the point of Pas Akum all year long. We can't, but at least a couple of days of the year we do. It comes out that those days of the year that we are makbid, it may be a real din derabanan. It may be binding in halacha, because the whole bittul of these takanas it was the Klal Yisrael who was mevatel the takanas, but if Klal Yisrael in a sense voted not to be mevatel them legamri, we're mevatel them 344 days a year, but 10 days a year we keep them. We're mevatel takanas Ezra 353 days a year, one day we keep it. That one day that we keep it is a din. It's not a minute. That's what. Yeah, that's what some Macharanim write that the Rosh quotes in Maseches Yuma, a tradition from Rav Gaon, that when you go to the mikveh in Erev Yom Kippur, you make a bracha. So the Rosh says, why? Well, based on what? Well, it's not a mitzvah. It's not a din deraisa, din derabanan. Why? So Tzipes Frank writes in his Sefer Mikra Kodesh, he thinks it's based on this idea. It's a takana. It's takanas Ezra. But takanas Ezra is long gone. It's gone, except for Yom Kippur, because Klal Yisrael, I guess we can call it a pesha hit to a pesha osir, to flip the terms around a little bit. We were makabel on these days of the year that the takana will be binding. That puts the whole pasakum into a different light. During the Seres Mechuvah, most people have the attitude, it's only a minhag, a chumrah, we'll find kulas. It's so simple. It may be a real din pasakum during the Seres Mechuvah, at least according to some. When we discuss, in a sense, change in halacha, so very often we find people quoting certain Mamar Chazal, that this is not something that just started in the last week, this is something that's been going on already for hundreds of years, quotes certain very famous Mamar Chazal that at first glance, without analyzing the sugya through the eyes of Chazal, sound like, in a sense, real changes, real abolishing, literally outright changes in halacha. The first one, the most famous one, of course, is the kind of Pruzbul. Here, it says in the Chumash Pashas, hey, Kar Shmitel Hashem, comes Hillel and says, well, there was an economic, social reality, people aren't lending money, and therefore we're going to quote-unquote change the halacha. We know, unfortunately, already 20 years ago in Europe, this was championed as Hillel was the first, to quote-unquote to change the halacha. So this could not be any further. This is clearly not at all what how to understand these sugyas. The Gemara says Gittin Daf Lamed Vav spends a lot of time analyzing exactly what is the background of this type of a sugya prosbul. And without going into the details of prosbul right now, what's clear as day from all these Mamar Chazal is that Hillel cannot just stam because there was a social, economic pressure change the halacha. That is not authentic Judaism. That's not part of our Masorah. The halacha doesn't change because there's a specific pressing need. What the pressing need can sometimes do is it can create the background for us to begin to go back to the sugya and say, wait a second, can we come up with some way to address this need? So Hillel has to go back to the world of prosbul, back to the world of Shemitah, and say, well, the Shemitah's ksafim bisman said, deraisa Shemitah's ksafim derabanan. Do we have a hefker beis and hefker? Do we not have a hefker beis and hefker? Do we have a moshe shtaros of the beis and do we not have a... There are halachic mechanisms that if there wouldn't have been a pressing need, maybe we wouldn't have gone down that route. That is possibly true. The Mashal, the Rishonim write in the end of Maseches Yevamos. So the Gemara says that there's a din that an Eid Echad comes, say that a husband died, so the husband died, the wife can remarry. So it's clear from the Gemara that in the previous generations they were not following this halacha. This was the days of Rabbi Akiva. It was mischadish to follow this din. If it was a din deraisa, so why weren't they following it? So the Rishon, the Ritva, and others explain that this is a very, very lomdish din, the din of Ne'amanos v'nei Echad. Whether it's a milsa that people legluye, whether it's isha daiko minsaba, a lot of different factors that go into this psak halacha. If you don't have husbands disappearing right and left, you're probably not going to come up with these solutions because there's no need, so you're not going to work your head to try to figure out a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. Post the time of the Churban, this became a very, very real problem. In wars, you had people disappearing right and left. So the Chacham Shvos Ador had to not Chalila v'Chalila change the halacha, but they had to go and reevaluate and try to figure out within the halachic system what, if anything, can we come up with to solve certain problems. And it's a what, if anything, because sometimes there is no solution. Not every problem in the world has a solution. I think, outside the realm of halacha, somehow people are able to accept that a little bit more. In the world of halacha, some people think that every problem has to have a solution. It's not true. There are some, I can't even call them problems, there are some issues that do not have a solution within the halachic system. So we have to take the attitude that we're going to try, when a problem comes up, when an issue, a challenge comes up, we're going to work really, really hard to try to figure out a way to come up with something, but it has to meet the criteria of the halacha. The math has to equal up. The prosbul doesn't just work because you have a problem, therefore there's a prosbul. It's got to work through the mechanism of Shemitah B'zman Hazeh D'Rabbanan. It's got to work through Hefker Beis and Hefker. It's got to work, the Heter of Eid Echad has to work through Milsa V'Dla Geluya. It has to be pre-existing halakhic klolim that can be used properly. The Rav used to give a mashal. I wasn't in the Rav Shia, but I've heard this from many people. Rav used to give the mashal, we used to call the atom bomb theory. So if you ask somebody, why does the atom bomb explode? How does it work? Why does it work? So the person's going to say to you that the reason why the atom bomb works is because the Japanese attacked at Pearl Harbor, there was World War II, that's why the bomb works. That's not why the bomb works. The bomb works because the Kadosh Baruch Hu put into Ma'aseh Bereshis thousands of years before equals MC squared, whatever the rules, whatever the physics of nuclear. You can tell my background is more in Jewish history than in physics, so I won't say too much. But the reason why the bomb blows up, the reason why, because there's truth to it, because the equation equals on the blackboard. There's a scientific truth behind it. What do we mean when we say that because of World War II there was a bomb? What that probably means is as follows. If not for the fact that there was an attack on Pearl Harbor, it could be that the American government may not necessarily put enough money into the Manhattan Project to create the back, and it could be they wouldn't have discovered the bomb. Maybe they would have, maybe they weren't. My expertise is not American history either. But it's foolish to confuse the existence of a Japanese attack as the physics for why the bomb works. The Japanese attack was the background, what forced the issue to the front to make us go back to the blackboard, go back to the laboratories and to figure out the science that's been there all along. It's possible the war wasn't there, Japanese didn't attack. Could be, maybe we wouldn't have bothered finding the bomb. But you cannot say, well, we had a need and therefore the bomb worked, because it's not true. Because if the physics doesn't work, then the bomb's just going to be a nut. It's not going to explode. It's not going to work. This is no shape or form. I'm not addressing atomic energy right now. This is not the forum. But I call upon the same thing that Rav said in the Ram of Halacha. There is a concept, as we spoke a lot about before, there's a concept of Shas Adchak. there's a concept of there was a real economic need to make sure people are lending money, and there was a tremendous tzarech that there were women whose husbands had disappeared in war. These were very real tzarechim that the Chachmei Torah in each generation had to address. We have even
Would you say that these were agenda-driven?
Gender agenda.
Agenda-driven also.
Agenda. I wasn't sure which one.
Because one of the critiques of some of the things we're hearing today is they have an agenda. And therefore it's automatically possible. But what you're suggesting is that the agenda forced them to come up with
the question, I think, unfortunately, sometimes the word agenda sometimes has a little bit of a negative connotation. The Gemara tells a story about how there was a shaila about in Hilchos Sota, whether a Gioras can become a Sota or not. Because the one hand the Torah says, be Yisrael, is that called Yisrael? I know Yisrael. So the Gemara tells a story how Shmai V'Avtalyon once paskin a shaila about a certain Gioras that she could in fact become subject to the regular halachas of Sota. So one of the people who heard this started to snicker and say, Shmai V'Avtalyon, because they were descendants of Gerim, so they wanted to show that Gerim are like regular Jews, so therefore they treated the woman like a. So the Gemara says they put that person to Gerim, because that was a zilzul, not just in Shmai V'Avtalyon, that was a zilzul in the whole Masorah. If people think that the Rabbanim are deciding things, the Gedolei HaPoskim are deciding things because they have personal, agendas. So that's clearly not that's clearly out of bounds in terms of understanding how Masorah works. Agenda in the sense of that we're trying our hardest to come to a conclusion, and we wouldn't necessarily have worked on this otherwise. 100%. I mean, we see the Ma'aseh B'chol Yom. You give an example that's closer to home in terms of the last couple hundred years. Mechiras Chametz. So in the Sugin Maseches Pesachim and Daf Chaf Aleph, though the Gemara doesn't really mention Mechiras Chametz. It mentions it in passing. There's a Tosefta. If a guy's on a boat and he realizes he can't get rid of his Chametz, so he tries to give the Chametz to a goy. It was a one tucked away Tosefta for thousands of years. Nobody thought of selling Chametz. Why? What do people have? A piece of bread, box of noodles. What do people have? Jews started entering into the whiskey business and other things, and Jews get a lot of food, and now it becomes a $1 billion industry. So how come nobody was selling chametz 1,000 years ago? It's because the lumdus didn't exist. The lumdus existed. So you roll a chametz, well, the shachat harav, you get the rosh halachem existed 1,000 years ago, existed 3,000 years ago. It wasn't necessary. It wasn't practical. So nobody developed the mechanism of mechiras chametz. Once it becomes necessary, then you have to go back to the world of halacha and develop the mechanism, but it has to be developed properly. I think it's so critical when we unfortunately sometimes hear this critique thrown at us, which says that if you would just work hard enough, you come up with a solution. That's not always true. It doesn't mean that we can take the attitude we're not going to work hard. We have to work hard. Whatever the issues are, the pressing issues, they have to be worked hard, but they have to be worked hard with the understanding that we're within bounds of halacha. And those bounds of halacha, really, I think, in a sense, the common theme of both shurim are what those common bounds of what those bounds of halacha are. Those bounds of halacha is apiyat Torah she'erucha. That those who are part of Chachmei Masorah. Right. So again, that was also a perfect example of something which had to find a halacha solution. And then you can have machlokim, whether it's a valid halacha solution. You had yesh v'yesh. There were some who thought that it was a workable solution, and there are those who thought that it was outside of the halacha. They felt that it was an incorrect usage of certain halachic terms. And again, there are a lot of elus, and there's no nimna v'gamru. You had gedolei dor, giving different opinions, and there are people who don't sell chametz either today. I mean, there can definitely have machlokim as to whether the particular solution is a viable solution or not. That idea that it has to be a viable solution, it has to be something that's working within halachic framework, and not just a statement that, well, there's a social need and therefore we're going to do whatever has to be done. So I think that's a very, very important point. That's something that gets lost in the shuffle in many of these discussions.
Good, Yashkov, thank you very much.